Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Brokos. If you somehow found this video not through me, I'll tell you briefly. I am the host of the Thinking Poker podcast, also the author of the Thinking Poker blog. I've been a professional poker player for about 13 years as of the time of the creation of this video. And this video is being created in connection with a fundraiser for the Bay Area Urban Debate League. So it's kind of a reward for for every $1,000 that this fundraiser raised, I was going to produce a free hour of video content. So those of you who contributed, thank you very much for doing so. Enjoy the video. If you did not contribute, feel free to watch the video anyway. My hope is that after watching, I'll have a link here at the end of the video. You can click to make a donation, proportionate to whatever you feel like the video was worth to you. So this is a kind of pay what you will operation here, and you're free to watch the video first. The video is going to be using a piece of software called PioSolver, Solver. Some of you may be familiar with it. Those of you who aren't, I'm just going to explain very briefly. And this is a much bigger concept that you may want to look into. But what this does essentially is with a set of inputs. So you can see here I've input a board. We're going to be looking at a river situation. So this is all the board cards have been dealt. You input a starting pot. You input effective stacks, and you input bet sizes. So here right now it's very simple. The players are allowed to bet or raise half of the pot, and that's kind of the only thing that they have available to them. And it'll give you unexploitable strategies. In other words, even if the one player told the other player, look, here's how I'm going to play every hand I could possibly have in this situation, there's still nothing the other player could really do to take advantage of that. So these are kind of like well-balanced ranges. And the focus here is going to be looking at actually different bet sizes. So I'm going to be changing this in a moment, allowing some different bet sizes for the out of position player. And we're going to be looking at both under betting, making a bet of 1/4 of the pot, and also over betting, making a bet of 3 times the pot. And I think these are both bet sizes that many people don't use very frequently. And I think a lot of people kind of don't understand under what circumstances you would want to use them. And I'm going to talk a bit about those things. Let me show you first the starting ranges that I have for both players. Very roughly, the situation that this is meant to model, and I kind of kept it simple because I want this to be something that, or I want to demonstrate some things that you can do even with the free PioSolver. So you can download this from PioSolver's website, and you can get a free version that'll enable you to do turn and river calculations. The paid version is required if you want to do flop and pre-flop calculations, which are much more calculation intensive. But the turn and river ones are free to do, and this is an example. We're just looking at river. You can input more complicated ranges if you have the full version and you want to go as far back as the flop. You can get unexploitable ranges for starting from the flop, and you're going to get somewhat different outcomes here because I'm using much simpler and more exploitable ranges for getting to the river in the first place. But the scenario we're kind of broadly modeling is one where the player in the cutoff has raised pre-flop, been called by the big blind, and then we get this ace of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 8 of clubs flop. Out of position player just checks 100% to the player who's in position. The in position player bets half pot with, I just kind of had him bet actually his full range on the flop. It's not really the best strategy for this situation, but I think it is a reasonable approximation of how many people play. So he just bets half pot with his full range, and then the out of position player does a very small amount of check raising, basically check raising like either extremely strong hands like 2 pair or better, or actually not even ace 9 or ace 8, but check raising 9 8, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, and then some of the very biggest draws, hands like jack 10 of diamonds, where it's both a straight and a flush draw. Other than that, basically check calling when he has a decent pair, check folding otherwise, a pair or draw, check folding otherwise. Then on the turn, we've got the in position player having a very different betting strategy, which again, I think this does, although it's far from optimal, I think it does mirror how many people actually play, which is to say that on the turn, the in position player does a lot of checking back. So after betting 100% on the flop, the turn is kind of only betting very strong hands or very strong draws and doing a lot of checking kind of like for pot control or just like not really following through all that much on bluffs unless it's a semi-bluff with a strong draw of some sort. So that kind of explains the origin of these ranges for getting to the river. This is the range that the out of position player has. In other words, these are hands that called a raise from the cutoff pre-flop, and then check call to bet on that flop. That's basically all the money out of position, has had to put into the pot, and now he gets to the river this way. The in-position player's range is going to be a little bit more defined by the fact that he checked behind the turn. And the significant thing here, with this river card being one that completes both a straight with 10-7 getting there and also a flush, right? The third diamond gets there on the river. And I think the out-of-position player's range, generally, even on the flop, is much stronger than the in-position player's range. Right? Remember, the in-position player was betting everything on the flop, including loads of bluffs. The out-of-position player was only calling when he had a pair or a good draw. So his range already, just for getting past the flop, is much stronger. Then on the turn, the in-position player further caps his range because he's, presumably betting, or I have him betting all of his strongest hands on the turn, as well as many of his strongest draws. So when we get to the river, what happens is the in-position player, after checking behind the turn, just very rarely has a strong hand on this river, and the out-of-position player easily could. The out-of-position player has lots of pairs, lots of flushes, some straights. The in-position player has very little of that kind of stuff, and not even a lot of great pairs. Like top pair is one of the better hands that the in-position player is going to have. So we're going to look first at the strategy in this scenario where players are only allowed to bet half of the pot or check. And we're going to go back to the root here. Okay, so the first thing we're finding is this is kind of to be expected given that the out-of-position player has the stronger range. The out-of-position player does want to be betting quite a lot. Out-of-position player is betting 75% of his range and only checking 25%. And the 75% includes basically any ace is strong enough that he can value bet. And then we've also got him, obviously betting like straights and flushes for the most part are betting. There's a little bit of check raising going on. So you see like 10-7 is sometimes, yeah. So like there's, when we look at hands that are checking, 10-7 does do some checking. I don't know that flushes actually are doing much checking. King 7 of diamonds, I guess, is doing a fair bit of checking. Yeah, so there's some flushes that are checking, presumably looking to check raise, but a lot of betting from the out of position player. And that's to be expected in a situation where he has a much stronger range. He can't really count on the in-position player to do the betting for him. The in-position player is very often going to have hands like pocket queens or something that are quite happy to, or even like ace-10, that are very happy to just check behind and go to showdown. So the out-of-position player, because he has a much stronger range, is going to be betting at a pretty high frequency because he mostly wants to put money in the pot when he has strong hands. In situations where he doesn't have strong hands, because he easily could have a strong hand, he wants to try to find some folds when he has those weaker hands, and so he's going to be betting at a pretty high frequency. And the in-position player is mostly going to be faced with decisions either calling or folding, not generally wanting to play a particularly large pot himself, but also not wanting to get bluffed. And if we click here, we can essentially have him bet, and then we can explore how the in-position player is responding to a bet. So you can see the in-position player is not doing much raising at all, mostly calling or folding. The little bit of raising that he does is, as Queen 10 of diamonds, I didn't have him bet on the turn. 10-7 of spades, I apparently didn't have him bet on the turn. A few of these are hands I think I actually meant to have him bet on the turn, so I meant to give him an even more polarized range than this. But you see he can get to the river with a few strong hands, and actually even pocket sixes turns out to be strong enough to raise for value. He doesn't have other sets in his range because those are all betting the turn. And then there's a little bit of bluffing happening. Pocket sevens is an appealing bluffing hand because it blocks 10-7. And then some unpaired hands are doing a small amount of bluffing on the river, particularly when they have a large diamond in them. The king of diamonds or the queen of diamonds makes for nice bluffing hands because they make it less likely that you're going to run into a flush. So this gives you a sort of a rough idea of what both players' strategies look like for playing this particular river situation. The main thing that I want to focus on is the expected value for the out-of-position player who's making these half-pot bets. And I'm going to look at how a few particular hands are performing. The first batch of hands that I want to look at are the nuts. So some of these hands you can see like King X of Diamonds basically has an expected value of a little over 18. So it's winning more than the pot, right? Basically it's expecting to win the pot plus sometimes an additional bet. That's essentially what that means to say that this has an expected value of 18 because there's only 13 in the pot. You know, when you have the nuts, you're guaranteed to win the whole pot. And then the reason that the expected value is greater than the pot is that these hands are sometimes going to win an additional bet as well. Also, if we look at some bluffing hands, to look, for instance, at the expected value of, so like some of the better bluffing hands is going to be a hand that has the Queen of Diamonds in it. So like Queen Jack offsuit, you can see these are, you know, in the neighborhood of like 0.4 to 0.5. Big blinds is what they're expecting to win, which is better than zero, right? I mean, zero is what they would get if they checked. So the fact that, you know, they are making a little bit of money by bluffing, not a lot, but they are making a little bit of money by bluffing. So that was a bit over 18 or 18 and a half we're seeing for the nuts, and about 0.5 that we're seeing for some good bluffing hands. And then in terms of hands that are making sort of like thin value bets, you know, ace three is one of the worst hands that the player is betting, and that is still winning pretty close to the pot. In other words, ace three is very often the best hand here, and it's not really in danger of getting bluffed out. So, you know, because the imposition player does so little bluffing, you know, both when check to and when facing a bet, the imposition player rarely has a strong hand to bet for value, so he can't do a lot of bluffing either. So ace three mostly, you know, when it's the best hand, it wins the pot, and it's the best hand pretty often. So you see the expected value of ace three is about 11. And if we look, you know, when we do bet, how often you're getting called, you know, many of the hands that are calling are better than ace three, but there's a number, like, you know, a lot of 9x is calling as well. So, you know, I don't think ace three is making a tremendous amount of money by value betting, but it is winning the pot, you know, most of the time that it has the best hand, and maybe winning a little bit additional by value betting. Where were we here? I was looking at. Okay, so what I want to change to now, and I've already got this, I've already run this, so I'm just gonna, not that it takes a long time to run these. If it's only the river, these calculations are quite quick to run. But you can see now here I've changed this for the out of position player. I've allowed him some additional bet sizes. Now he's allowed to bet 25% of the pot. He's allowed to bet 300% of the pot. Or when he check raises, he can either raise half the pot, or he can actually make a 3 times the pot raise. And we're going to look at how this affects the expected value of some of those hands that I was looking at before. So now when we go to the browser and look, we're seeing that the out of position player has an even higher betting frequency than he had before. If you remember before, it was about 75% bets and 25% checks. So now we're up to 86% bets, giving him those additional bet sizes. Really, it's the smaller bet size that's enabling most of these bets. Well, a little bit the larger bet size. But giving them these additional bet sizes means that there are some hands that could not profitably bet half the pot, but they can profitably bet either 3 times the pot or 1/4 of the pot. Still doing a little bit of checking, but betting now at a higher frequency. And this may surprise some people, but, you know, this is not a particularly rare option that's chosen. Now, this is a sort of extreme situation where there's a quite significant advantage in terms of which player is more likely to have a flush. But when you consider that most human players never overbet the pot, right? I mean, how often do you see somebody bet 3 times the pot? So when you consider most real players don't ever bet 3 times the pot, and yet PioSolver is saying that it's optimal to bet 3 times the pot with 22% of your range in this situation, that's a pretty significant deviation between how humans are playing and what the optimal strategy is. And we can talk a little bit about how to, I mean, a couple things are happening. One is, you know, if you're the human player who's not ever overbetting, what you're essentially doing is, well, let's look at what you're doing. Okay, so let's look at what is your range for making these overbets, and it's the highlighted hands here in yellow. Actually, maybe the easiest way to look at this, if we look at it here. So this shows like the darkest red is the hands that are overbetting, and then this color is betting half pot, this is quarter pot, this is checking. So the hands that are just like strictly overbetting, like king queen of diamonds, never bets any amount other than 3x pot, and probably if we allowed it to bet 4x pot, it would want to bet 4x pot. Like 3x isn't even necessarily the optimal size here; it's just the size that I chose. So that's a hand that really wants to overbet, even more so than like king jack or king 10 of diamonds. Oh no, actually they're both doing it at a pretty high frequency too. But yeah, so like these nut hands are overbetting a lot. And if you remember before, the expected value when we had king queen of diamonds or any king x of diamonds was in the neighborhood of 18. And if we look now, what's the expected value when we're allowed to overbet? Now we've got an expected value pushing up to like 22. So being able to make this larger bet, we should be winning more money. And I mean, that's not, well, so on the one hand, it might sound obvious, like, okay, well, of course you're going to win more money if you're making a larger bet. But again, that's not how most people play. I mean, I think if you play No Limit Hold'em, you've been in a situation before where you had the nuts on the river and you probably didn't bet 3 times the pot. So if it's really so obvious that like, oh yeah, well, of course you're going to have a higher expected value if you bet larger, well, you're not doing that. And I think when you ask people, as I often do with people who I coach, why are you not betting 3 times the pot, right? You're allowed to. It's No Limit Hold'em. You can bet as much as you want. But so many people play as though there's this invisible rule that says you can't bet more than the pot, or not a lot more than the pot anyway. So why do people not do this? And often the answer I get is, well, I want to win something when I have the nuts. If I just bet 3 times the pot, my opponent's going to fold, especially in a situation where I'm like pretty sure he doesn't have much. And that's the situation here. After checking behind the turn, the imposition player is pretty unlikely to have a strong hand on this river. So in all likelihood, when we bet 3 times the pot, it seems like there's a good chance he's just going to fold and we're going to win nothing, right? Why not make a more, quote, normal bet? Why not bet half the pot with king queen of diamonds? Well, clearly the imposition player is not supposed to be folding that often when we make these large bets. Now, it may be the case that your real-life opponents are folding very frequently when you make large overbets of the pot. And then, so the question is, well, if you really believe that's true, that your opponent is just going to fold way too often when you make big overbets, well, then do you overbet as a bluff? Is this a situation where if you get here and you have Jack 10 offsuit, especially if one of them's a diamond, or you have Queen Jack offsuit and one of them's a diamond, are you betting 3 times the pot? Again, most people are going to say no, they're not doing that. And the reason they often give, well, either it just doesn't occur to them or something, or they feel like it's going to be obvious that it's a bluff, or they're afraid their opponent just rivered a flush or something like that. And I mean, essentially, it kind of feels to me like trying to have it both ways, where you're saying, well, I can't bet 3 times the pot for value, but I also can't bet 3 times the pot as a bluff. And, what Pio is saying here is that actually the most profitable thing to do is probably to do both, unless you have an idea, and this will often be the case when you're playing against a human opponent. You might have an idea of saying, okay, this player is just never calling a 3 times pot bet, so I don't want to do that when I have the nuts, but I do want to do it as a bluff. I mean, it may make sense for exploitive reasons to do just one or the other of these things, to only overbet as a bluff or to only overbet for value. But I think often you're going to be in a situation where you're not really sure how your opponent's going to respond if you bet 3 times the pot. And the point here is that it's actually more profitable, rather than never betting 3 times the pot, it's actually more profitable to do it with both, to do it with both nut hands and bluff hands. And that way, kind of no matter what your opponent does, it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. So you can see that with the nuts, right, we're doing about 4 big blinds better. And this is significant. I mean, that's about a third of the pot. So we're improving our win rate by about a third of the pot by allowing overbets with these very strong hands. And we come down and look at our bluffs. The bluffs actually also are doing a bit better. So we saw before that bluffing with the queen of diamonds and a jack, that seemed to be worth somewhere between 0.4 and 0.5 big blinds. And now it's up to being worth 0.7 or 0.8 big blinds. And that's not a real dramatic change. In fact, the more dramatic change here is that our bluffing frequency has also gone up. Because the bet size is larger, we can include more bluffs in our betting range. The opponent, and we could tell the opponent we're doing this, right? I could say, okay, before I was playing a strategy where I was only betting half the pot, and my bluffing frequency was X, whatever that is. Now I'm playing a new strategy where I'm allowed to bet half the pot or bet 3 times the pot, and I'm going to increase my bluffing frequency. I could tell my opponent I'm now going to be bluffing more than I was before, and there's still nothing my opponent could do about it. And the reason for that is that because the bet is larger, even when he knows that I'm bluffing more often, that doesn't mean that he can call more often, because when I'm not bluffing, he loses more. And so as long as the proportions are right, as long as I'm still betting in proportion to my value bets, if the bet is larger, I can have more bluffs in that betting range, and my opponent still can't exploit that by calling me. So what we're seeing is not only that individual bluffing hands have a higher expected value, what we're also seeing is that we're able to bet these hands at a higher frequency. So even if they had the same expected value, even if Queen Jack was worth 0.5 big blinds either way, we could bluff more frequently with the Queen Jack if we use the larger bet size. So that's really where a lot of the value is coming from. It's not even so much that when you bluff it's worth more, it's that you can bluff with more hands without being exploited by an opponent who decides to just be very sticky on the river. Like if you just decided to bluff every single time that you had a missed hand on the river, you bet 3x pot, well then a player who didn't fold to 3x pots very much would kind of end up exploiting you. And it wouldn't necessarily be based on knowing that you played that way. It might just be that they're a fish who never folds, but you're going to end up kind of playing straight into their hands if you do this too frequently. The other hand that we were looking at ace three, and saying that was like one of the worst hands that we were value betting before, and it actually looks like the expected value of ace three has gone down slightly relative to betting, and that's surprising to me. Try to look at this a little more closely. Oh, I see. So ace three is actually not preferring, it's not using the small bet too often. So it seems like maybe the hand that we ought to look at more in terms of a hand that's choosing to use the small bet pretty frequently is like 10-9 or Jack-9. So these are hands that are choosing, like, so we talked about overbetting, and the hands that want to overbet tend to be either very strong hands that are overbetting for value, or very weak hands that are overbetting as a bluff. And then the hands that like to make smaller bets, so the hands that benefit from making smaller bets, it's actually a lot of like 9x. So you can kind of think of this, a blocking bet. That's something that many players have heard of before. And so the idea of making the small bet on the river is that we often get to the river with a hand like Queen 9, Jack 9, 10-9, that there's a good chance it's the best hand. But at the same time, it's kind of hard. There's not a lot of reason why the opponent would call a bet with a worse hand than 10-9, because there's so many better hands we could have as well. So when I bet the river, I might have ace jack, I might have a set, I might have a flush, I might have a straight. So there's so many good hands I could have that it's kind of like, okay, if my opponent has an ace, he's going to call the river. But if he has like 8-7, is he going to call a river bet? Maybe not, in which case, it's kind of hard to value bet 10-9 when the only hands that are going to call you are like ace high. So the thing about betting smaller with hands like these is that the smaller you bet, the more your opponent's supposed to call. And this, again, it's the sort of thing where I could literally say to my opponent, okay, now that I'm allowed to bet less than half the pot, I'm not going to be bluffing very often when I do that, right? When I just bet a quarter of the pot, I'm almost always going to have a hand that I think is the best hand. And even though I'm telling my opponent that, I'm saying I'm not bluffing very much. There's nothing that my opponent can do to exploit me, because I don't have to be bluffing very much to make his fold a mistake. If he decides like, oh, this guy's probably not bluffing very often, I'm going to fold. Well, the times that I am bluffing, I'm getting a great price. I'm winning a lot with very little risk. So I'm winning 13 big blinds with a risk of only 3 big blinds. So it's a great opportunity for me on the rare occasion that I am bluffing. If we look at what kind of hand is going to be bluffing in this spot, we do see some like Queen 10, Queen Jack making these small bets. The one concern that people often have about blocking bets is they'll say, well, isn't it kind of obvious, right? If I mostly just have this kind of not very strong hand where I don't even really want to bet it. It's just like, well, if I check, it's not going to be that pleasant of a situation if my opponent bets either. So by betting small, I can kind of like squeeze a little bit sometimes when I have the best hand and maybe preempt him from making a larger bet, something like that. But if we only bet, we only have this kind of hand when we bet 3, when we bet 1/4 of the pot, then we might wonder, well, couldn't the opponent make a big raise? Couldn't he just say, well, this is very obviously a blocking bet, and therefore I'm going to make a large raise as a bluff and push you off of your 9? And so what we're going to see, the PioSolver allows for that possibility. This is essentially what how you can find your own, do sort of like a human equivalent of PioSolver, is you walk through this analysis and you say, okay, I would like to make a small bet with a hand like 10-9. How could my opponent exploit that? Oh, he could make a big raise. Okay, how could I take advantage of it? If betting small is going to cause my opponent to make a big raise, well, now suddenly betting small seems kind of appealing when I have a very strong hand. Or maybe I just bet small and then close my eyes and call and sort of hope for the best when I call. So you can think about, well, if I do a thing that I'm worried that it's exploited, if I do a thing and I'm worried that that thing could be exploited, well, then I have to say, all right, the next step is, what could my opponent do to exploit me? If my opponent knew that this were my strategy, how could he exploit it? And then I can turn around and say, now, how could I respond? How could I build out my strategy further such that that play wouldn't actually be that appealing for my opponent? And we can look at what PioSolver recommends here. So when we bet 3, the opponent, and it helps here that the opponent is not allowed to make a huge raise. So I didn't give the imposition player the option of overbetting the pot. And in fact, if the imposition player were allowed to make a very large raise on the river, and if he were allowed to make a 3x pot himself, the profitability of betting 3 would go down a little bit. We would still do it sometimes, but it wouldn't be quite as appealing of an option because we'd be opening ourselves up to a much larger raise. So when we bet 3, the only risk is that we get raised for half the pot, and we still are going to be getting 3-1 on a call. So he's going to raise, and now we're just going to have to call sometimes. And sometimes, by the way, we're going to raise all in. In fact, a fair amount of the time, we're going to raise all in. So sometimes we're going to have king 8 of diamonds, and when we have the nuts, we make that small bet sort of like as bait, and then the opponent raises, and then we're like, super, now I'm all in. And if we're going to be going all in as a value bet, occasionally we're going to want to go all in as a bluff. And let's see, what hand are we doing? So Jack 8 of diamonds is still flush. Try to find, what's the non-flush hand that's going all in. I see, it's A7 is turning into a bluff. That's what it is. So, we're taking a hand like A7 that initially we were betting as sort of like a blocking or a thin value bet, and then when we get raised, sometimes because A7, when we have A7, it's less likely the opponent has 10-7 or 7-5. So sometimes when we get raised on the river, we're like, well, A7, I don't know, I could call with it. It's an all right bluff catcher, but maybe occasionally I'm just going to go all in as a bluff, and I might actually cause my opponent to fold a better hand, even though I thought I was value betting A7. Once I get raised, I kind of change my mind, and I'm like, well, it's also a pretty good bluffing hand, and I might actually make you fold set by going all in with A7. I think that's kind of the idea behind this play. The 7-6 doing a little bit of the same thing. Pocket 10s doing a little bit of the same thing. So we've got a couple of hands that they're actually going to raise all in as a bluff, and then sometimes we just close our eyes and call. So sometimes we're just betting ace jack, and we're not really happy about getting raised, but we know there's a possibility the opponent is bluffing when he raises, so we just sort of close our eyes and call sometimes with some hands that we're not thrilled about, but we make those calls in order so that it won't be profitable to do this as a bluff raise. So what we're seeing here essentially is that, and I want to go back and look at the expected value of betting the 9 here, but what we're seeing basically is that the time when you want to use these different bet sizes is often in situations where you have this pretty significant range advantage over your opponent. And range advantage can kind of mean two different things, but here we have both, right? It's both. We have more equity than the opponent. Like, it's more likely that that we have the best hand, and also it's easier for us to have an extremely strong hand. Like, it's a lot easier for the out of position player to have a hand like a straight or a flush than it is for the in position player to have those same things. Sorry, this is popping up. One second. Okay, hopefully I've turned that off. So the way that we can kind of leverage the fact that we could have a strong hand so much more easily than our opponents could is by overbetting. By like the fact that we could have those strong hands, but we also could be bluffing, will sort of both our strong hands and our bluffs benefit from making the larger bets. The strong hands are happy to make larger bets because they win more money when they get called, and the weak hands are happy to make larger bets because they're less likely to get called. So both of these hands benefit from making larger bets, and the fact that we're making the large bet with both of them means that there's no easy way for their opponent to respond to it. Or the opponent can't just say, oh, a big bet, that's obviously a value bet, I fold. Okay, if he decides to do that, he sort of punishes me when I have the nuts, but he also gets punished when I'm bluffing. And if he decides to do the opposite and say, oh, a big bet, that's obviously a bluff, I call. Okay, well, he does punish me when I'm bluffing, but I also win more when I'm value betting. And so because I'm doing it with both, there's no easy way for him to, for my opponent to take advantage of that. The underbet is mostly a tool that's preferred by these kinds of like medium strength hands where there's a pretty good chance they're good, but your opponent doesn't have a whole lot of incentive to call a bet with worse. So the way that you compensate the way that you compensate your opponent for the fact that your range overall is pretty strong, right? That's why he's not really compelled to call a river bet, because there's so many ways that the out of position player could be strong here that the in position player just doesn't have that much reason to call a bet with like third pair. And so the way that you compensate him for the fact that you have such a strong range is by offering really appealing pot odds. And so you say, okay, you're right, you probably are beat, but you only have to win 1 time out of 5 to win this pot. So, are you beat 80% of the time? It's not just are you beat probably, it's are you beat 80% of the time. And again, if he decides to say, oh, bet at $3, that couldn't possibly be a bluff, I fold. Okay, well, the times that it is a bluff, I profit from that. And if he says, well, $3, that's obviously a weak hand, I'm going to raise. Okay, well, the times that I'm making that little bet as a trap, I'm going to profit from it. Or the times that I'm making that little bet and then I'm just, closing my eyes and bluff catching, I'm going to profit from the fact that he decided to bluff there. So everything is sort of balanced out, even though there are some counter strategies that limit the effectiveness of these tools. So I can't just overbet 100% of the time, but I can do some overbetting in a way that there's really nothing my opponent can do about it. And ultimately, it's better than just always betting half pot. Where we saw that these hands had higher expected values when they were overbetting. Both the bluffs and the value bets had a higher expected value. And we got to bluff at a higher frequency when we're making the overbets. So we're benefiting in a number of ways from overbetting. And the last thing that I wanted to look at was the expected value on these thin value bets. So I'm going to come back to hands that are betting 3. And that was like, these hands here. So these hands have an expected value of around 7 when they're allowed to make the quarter pot bet. And I want to come back and look at, in the half pot scenario, how are these hands doing? Not a real dramatic difference, actually. They're doing about the same whether they're betting half pot or quarter pot. So I'm trying to think about what's the difference? What's the benefit of being allowed to bet smaller? Well, King 8 of diamonds. What's the strategy with King 8 of diamonds? Oh, that's right. This is... Let me pause this for a second and figure out where exactly the value is coming from with this underbet. Okay, this turned out to be an interesting little puzzle, more interesting than I was expecting. And the answer might turn out to be a little anticlimactic. So I think part of it is that adding the option for the underbet in this situation actually doesn't dramatically improve the expected value of the out of position player. Like the difference for the hands that are underbetting is not that huge compared to the hands that really benefited a lot from overbetting. I think it was a relatively dramatic difference in terms of how much better those hands were doing as a result of being allowed to overbet. I think the underbet doesn't have as dramatic of a difference in this situation, so that's part of it. But what I actually ended up doing here, I realized I'd made 2 changes at once. Right, I went from only being allowed to bet half pot to being allowed to half pot, overbet, or underbet. And you can actually see a little more in focus where the difference in value comes from of being allowed to underbet when we look at when we look at a scenario where underbetting is not allowed, but overbetting is. So now, we're allowed to bet half pot, we're allowed to bet 3x pot, but there's no underbet option. And now if we go and we look at the expected value of these hands that like the underbet, you can see that they're a bit lower. So actually the fact that so essentially what's happened here, so now these hands are betting half pot, and they're actually doing less well in this scenario where we've allowed the option of overbetting. The hands that are overbetting are benefiting from this. So, as we saw, like in a scenario where King Queen suited was allowed to only bet half pot, it was winning about 18. Now it's winning closer to 22. However, some hands are doing a little bit less well as a result of this. So now hands like 10-9 suited, Jack-9 suited, Queen-9 suited are actually doing less well in this scenario, even though they're betting the same amount that they were before, right? So when our only option was bet half pot or check, these hands were winning more like 7 to 7.5. Now they're winning more like 6.5 to 7. Even though their bet size hasn't changed, they're still betting 6. And so the reason these hands are doing a little bit less well is that now your range for betting 6 is a little more vulnerable because a lot of your very strongest hands are preferring to bet 39. When you bet 6, you're a bit more vulnerable to getting bluff raised, like we talked about. And now there are things you can do to kind of make it not too appealing for your opponent to raise you as a bluff. But, to some degree, like your opponent is going to be able to do some profitable bluffing when you bet 6. And essentially that's just a trade-off worth taking, right? I mean, the King-Queen suited is doing so much better from overbetting that you can just kind of accept that some other hands in your range that don't particularly want to get raised when they bet 6, these hands do a little bit less well once they're no longer protected by the overbets. They're a little bit more vulnerable to getting raised. And so allowing these hands to bet 3 instead of betting 6, now they lose a little bit less the times that they get raised. So the main thing these hands want, they don't really mind getting called, they don't mind getting folded, they mostly just don't want to get raised. And so the less that they bet, the less that they're going to be punished when they do get raised. And so allowing them to bet 3, you can see that this actually sort of counteracts the effect of that the overbet had. So introducing the overbet into the strategy weakened our range when we bet smaller, and we can counteract that effect by also introducing an underbet. I think that's the best way to kind of tell this story. So I actually found that a little interesting, having to solve that problem for myself just now. But hopefully you found it interesting to think a little bit about overbetting and underbetting and why those things might be valuable additions to your strategy. I'm going to conclude this video by talking a little bit about the how to counteract this. Both so for the imposition player, right? How might the imposition player respond to underbets and overbets, but also how to avoid ending up in this situation in the first place, which I think is actually the kind of more important aspect, rather than how best should you handle a spot where you've gotten to the river and it's so easy for your opponent to have a strong hand and so hard for you to have one. How to avoid running into that situation in the first place. Before I do that, though, I do want to remind people about the organization that is kind of the reason that this video exists, and request donations from those of you who haven't contributed to this campaign already. The Bay Area Urban Debate League, it's a 501c3 nonprofit, so donations to them are tax deductible. It's an organization that I've been involved with for a couple of years. I actually don't live in the Bay Area at the moment, but I used to. I probably will again. And debate made a big difference for me when I was in high school and when I was in college, in terms of a lot of things. I mean, I think helping me be more comfortable with being a person who is interested in academic things, giving me more sort of confidence. And then, of course, the stuff you might more obviously expect to come from debate, like being better at articulating my ideas, being able to think through multiple positions on a particular topic or concept or whatever. I mean, it's stuff that I think has actually been useful in poker and also in teaching poker, being able to see things and explain things from different perspectives. So I felt like debate did a lot for me as a student, and I've been involved in this urban debate movement, which is not just in the Bay Area, but many big cities in the United States, with the Chicago Urban Debate League. Actually founded an urban debate league in Boston and worked with them for a long time. So this particular organization and also this movement is one I've had a pretty deep involvement with. And many of the schools that are served by the Bay Area Urban Debate League, as much as I at a relatively affluent public school, still kind of struggled with like being a person who is interested in academics, or found that something that was challenged by my peers sometimes, it can be a much bigger problem in urban schools, that kids who kind of want to be smart or want to participate in an academic activity, they don't always have an outlet for that. And so, among many other things, debate provides that. But, just kind of all the things that I feel like I get out of debate, there really are kids who need those things much more than I did, who can get those things in an urban debate league, like what the Bay Area Urban Debate League provides. So I'm actually a member of the board of directors of this organization. I've volunteered with them. I contribute my own money to them. I contribute my own time. It's an organization that I feel does pretty great work, and I'm happy to raise money for them this time of year. To contribute, there's you can click the link right here in this video, or you can go to razoo.com if you want to do this the complicated way. Type in my last name here, which is like this. We're going to turn up so you can see this is last year's fundraiser. This is our current fundraiser here. And click this donate button. Make your donations, and look at these fine folks. Daniel Singer, Stephanie Maris, Chris Nagy, Brendan Kaufman, Anonymous. Appreciate the contributions from all of you. And hopefully those of you, there are some people who've donated like on Facebook or other places as well, so don't be thrown by the 14. We do have more donors than that. But yeah, this is the easiest place. If you're watching this video and you haven't contributed already, I would encourage you to click that link and just donate whatever you feel like this video was worth to you. I would appreciate it, and we'll get back to our strategy now. Thanks. Okay, what we're going to look at now is how to respond to these various sized bets as the imposition player, and as I said, even more importantly, how to avoid getting into these spots in general as the imposition player. Because once you're responding to an overbet, you're really just kind of making the best of a bad situation. And really what you want to focus on more than anything is how to avoid getting into that situation in the first place. But supposing, you're facing this 3x pot bet, what can you do? You don't have a lot of opportunities to raise because it's so easy for the out of position player, the player betting, to have the nuts. It's hard to raise hands that aren't the nuts for value, because if you do go all in over that bet, it's kind of easy for the out of position player. Like, he doesn't really have to do much calling except when he has the nuts, so it's hard for you to shove a hand for value that's not the nuts. And it's also hard for you to bluff, because again, it's so easy for the out of position player to have the nuts here that he's not going to have a lot of difficult decisions when you shove. He can kind of just like fold if he doesn't have the nuts, call if he does have the nuts, and he'll do pretty well. And so it's hard for you to have much of a raising range against that. So mostly you fold. I mean, when you're facing a bet of 3 times the pot, you are supposed to fold a lot. And I know this is sort of why people don't want to bet 3 times the pot when they have the nuts, is because they're like, well, I don't want to only get called 21% of the time. But you do want to win 3 times the pot the times that you get called. You have to look at the good and bad. So you do need to be calling sometimes, because we know that this 3x pot bet could be a bluff, or at least if it's coming from a good player. Now again, just as with when we're making the 3x pot bet, when you're facing a big bet like this, it's entirely possible, in fact, it's likely, that the player you're playing against is not an elite, a human equivalent of an elite poker playing artificial intelligence. And it is, in fact, it's quite likely that your opponent is doing something exploitable. Many players will only have value hands when they overbet. Sometimes you'll encounter players who are bluffing too often when they overbet. Not a lot of people are going to be perfectly balanced in this situation. So if you believe you have some insight to say, well, this is probably just a value hand, and then it's perfectly fine to fold more than what PioSolver is going to recommend. Or if you believe this particular opponent, you say, oh, he only overbets as a bluff, or he mostly overbets as a bluff, it's perfectly fine for you to call more than PioSolver recommends. These recommendations are really just for dealing with an unknown strategy, right? An unexploitable strategy is going to be the optimal response. This is where game theory optimal comes from. It's the optimal response to an unknown strategy. So if you're just facing an overbet and you have no idea what that overbet means, the optimal response is going to be to call in kind of a balanced way. We look at what kinds of hands want to be calling that bet. An ace sometimes just sort of has to shrug and call. And it's interesting looking at this is a good tool generally for using PioSolver or any of these like equilibrium solvers. There are others as well. Is you want to look for indifference. This is a term that you'll hear in game theory a lot. And the idea behind indifference is that you're indifferent between two different choices. In other words, the expected value, the amount of money that you expect to make by, to take an example, Queen 10, actually that's going to be a complicated one because it's sometimes raising and sometimes folding. Let's look at, here, this is a good one, 9-7. So with 9-7, with a straight, facing a 3x pot bet, you're indifferent between calling and folding. That means that calling and folding have the same expected value for you. And the frequency with which you do these things matters, because if you call too often, then give your opponent incentive to never bluff you. But if you don't call often enough, you give your opponent incentive to bluff you too much, or you reward opponents who never bluff and reward opponents who bluff too much, respectively. So the frequency matters, but it turns out that against an opponent who is actually betting an optimal frequency, it doesn't really matter whether you call or fold with these hands. Either way, you win 0 on average. So when you fold, of course, you win 0. And when you call, it ends up, the times that he's bluffing basically cancel out the times that he's not bluffing, and you win 0 by calling with this particular hand. So it can be useful to look for indifference points. These are often, and when you're not indifferent, when you don't see this, so indifference means that you're going to be split between two strategies. The only time that a solver is going to recommend a mixed strategy, in other words, sometimes call, sometimes fold, is when those two options have the same expected value. It's never going to say, well, calling is better than folding, but sometimes you should fold anyway. That never happens. Or never. It also never says, well, folding's better than calling, but you have to call sometimes to stop your opponent from bluffing. Right? Either it's profitable to call, or you don't do it. There's no like call anyway to stop them from bluffing. If it's not profitable to call, then you'd rather just let them bluff rather than pay off the value bet at too high of a frequency. So these mixed strategies always indicate that you're indifferent between two options. So this can be interesting because it kind of gives you a sense of like, what's the weakest hand that you might consider calling with? So it's interesting here that there's actually a few different kinds of hands that are indifferent between calling or folding. So like 9-7, a straight is indifferent between calling and folding. But then also ace-jack with no diamond is indifferent between calling and folding. So there's actually a kind of complicated thing going on here involving blockers. The 7 is kind of a significant card. This isn't a straight. That's never mind. Okay, I thought it was weird that we'd be indifferent to calling with a straight. This is just a pair with a blocker. So it might seem kind of weird to say, well, why is it that like we strictly prefer calling with a7? Like a7 is not indifferent between calling and folding. A7 just always calls. But then we don't always call with ace-jack. That seems weird. Like, what, isn't ace-7 a worse hand than ace-jack? So why would I like sometimes fold ace-jack but never fold ace-7? And the answer to that has to do with the 7. The 7 in your hand means that you're less likely to run into 10-7 or 7-5, which are both hands that the out-of-position player will sometimes be betting 3 times the pot with when you have a 7 in your hand. So this is the reason why hands like 9-7 and 8-7 have some interesting calling here. But it's interesting to see like what are the hands that are indifferent between calling and folding versus what are the hands that just strictly prefer calling, and what is it about these hands that make them so much better for calling. So again here, like ace-6, pocket sixes is one of the hands that the out-of-position player, or no, actually I don't think it is. So why is it that these hands strictly prefer calling to folding? I believe it's actually that they don't have a blocking effect on bluffs. Right. So if you think about what kinds of hands are making this big bet as a bluff, the most common hand was like queen jack and queen 10. So not having a queen or a 10 a queen or a jack in your hand, I guess actually queen 10 wasn't doing as much bluffing. Queen jack and queen 10 were the primary that's right. Queen, jack, and queen 10 were the primary bluffing hands. And so having a queen or a jack or a 10 in your hand makes calling a little bit less appealing. And so that's why we see actually these stronger aces are calling at a lower frequency. They're kind of indifferent between calling or folding, or ace 10 actually strictly prefers folding, whereas the weaker aces, they strictly prefer calling. So these hands are kind of like, even though they only beat bluffs, it is actually like there's a decent chance, a good enough chance that your opponent is bluffing. Even facing a 3x pot bet, you don't have to win half the time in order to show a profit when you call with a hand that can only beat a bluff. So it's interesting to see, what kinds of hands are better for bluff catching. And when you're thinking about how to respond to an overbet, you're not going to be able to call up a graph like this in your head and necessarily say, okay, I'm supposed to call with ace queen suited 32.2% of the time, and I'm supposed to call with ace jack suited 76.7% of the time. The idea isn't to call up and get these numbers exactly right. It's to also often, what might happen when you're facing an overbet is you say, I kind of think my opponent isn't very likely to be bluffing here. A lot of people just won't bluff when they bet 3 times the pot, but I don't really know that, so I don't want to do anything too drastic, because if it turns out that he is bluffing, it's going to be a big mistake if I just, kind of fold 90% of the time or something to his bluff. So maybe I'm going to overfold a little bit, but not too much. And so it's helpful to know, well, how do I know, should I call this time, yes or no? So I can answer a broad strategic question about how frequently do I want to be calling this river in general. But then I also still have to make a decision, even if I am going to call the river, let's say, 70% of the time, or I guess 20% of the time, I'm going to be calling the river 20% of the time. How do I know whether this is one of those 20% of times? And your card should have an influence on this. It's not just, use a random number generator, and if it's 20 or less, call. Because there are certain hands that you never want to be calling with. Like, calling here with king 9 is just going to be a bad idea. Calling here with queen 9, unless you really believe your opponent is bluffing way too much, these generally are going to be pretty bad hands to call with. So you don't want to call, you don't want to be just as likely to call with king 9 as you are to call with ace 6. Ace 6 is a better hand for calling with. And in fact, ace 6 is even a better hand for calling with than ace queen or ace jack. So it's useful to keep in your head and to try to tell yourself a story like I'm doing here about where is this stuff coming from? What is it that makes ace queen or ace jack not such a good calling hand? What makes these better calling hands? Why are these more appealing to call with? And we can do the same thing with raising, although there's so little raising going on here right now. But it turns out, well, here this isn't really a mixed strategy. It's just a difference. Like queen 10 of diamonds wants to raise, and other queen 10s strictly want to fold because they block bluffs. So, like queen jack and queen 10 are particularly poor bluff catchers. Well, and they just can't even beat, they don't even necessarily beat all bluffs. So these are terrible hands to call with. The only reason this looks like a mix is because of the possibility of having the flush. Yeah, so here's an interesting example. So king 10 offsuit, right? This is a hand that can't beat a bluff, so it's not an option for calling. When you have king 10 offsuit, you mostly want to fold, but it turns out you can do a little bit of bluffing with king 10 offsuit, and that's when you have the king of diamonds in your hand. So again, we can say, occasionally we are going to raise the river for value, even though we're never going to have the nuts in this situation. I didn't allow the imposition player to have the nuts. I said imposition is always going to be betting nut flush draws on the turn. So the only flush that the imposition player could have was that queen 10 of diamonds. But he will occasionally have it, and even facing a 3x pot bet, he still wants to go all in when he has the queen 10 of diamonds, because it's quite unlikely, for the out of position player to have the nuts. Often that would be king queen of diamonds or king 10 of diamonds, which obviously he's not going to have if you have queen 10 of diamonds in your hand. So queen 10 of diamonds wants to go all in for value, expected to get called by worse, and that means that I need to do a little bit of bluffing there, right? I can't only have value hands, or I would be very easy to play against. So occasionally, I need to go all in as a bluff. Not very often at all, right? I'm not doing a lot of bluffing here, but a very little bit of the time, I need to go all in as a bluff, and I don't want to do that randomly. I don't want to be as likely to bluff when I have, king, queen of spades, as when I have king 10 with the king of diamonds in my hand. Having the king of diamonds in your hand is a pretty big deal if you're going to bluff, because it makes it less likely that your opponent, right, it makes it impossible for your opponent to have nuts. And so, just kind of looking at these, which hands never call, which hands sometimes call, which hands always call, and trying to find the explanations behind those things. That's what I find most useful for working with a solver. I think sometimes people get the idea, or just people who don't have a lot of experience working with solvers, they see these really complicated outputs and they say, well, how the hell am I ever supposed to replicate this? Like, okay, great, PioSolver can spit out this thing that tells me to do something 33.2% of the time, but how do I do that as a human? You don't. I don't anyway. Maybe there are some humans out there who can do it. What I do is I try to get a sense of, which are the best hands for calling, which are the best hands for folding, and then that helps me to make more informed in-game decisions. I'm still thinking about how I expect my opponents to play, but I try to have a sense of, how badly am I going to be deviating from the optimal strategy if I choose to fold this particular hand, or to call with this particular hand. So I think it's useful to know when you have one of the best calling hands versus when you have a hand that you should never really consider calling with. I find that useful. The other thing, though, that really would be nice, like the reason why the imposition player is over a barrel so much in the first place, is that he just never gets to the river with strong hands. And this is not a random river card. Like, this is a river card that completes particularly many draws. But at the same time, just always betting flush draws on the turn, or almost always betting flush draws on the turn, is part of what creates this problem. And so we can use that same iterative process that we were talking about before, where once you identify something as exploitable, then you can kind of step back and say, okay, well, how could it be exploited? And what can I do to sort of lessen the impact of that exploit? So what's happening here is that when the river card is a diamond, particularly a card that completes multiple draws, we're very vulnerable to overbets, right? Because the out of position player can overbet a wide variety of hands for value, not only flushes, not only the nuts anyway. So we can overbet a wide variety of hands for value and also do some bluffs. And there's just not really a whole lot I can do about it. I can try to like bluff catch at an optimal frequency, but that's still not a great outcome. I'm still that, like, because if it's good for the out of position player, it's got to be bad for the in position player. It's a zero-sum game. So if overbetting is benefiting the out of position player, it's hurting me in some way. And the hands of mine that are hurting are these bluff catchers. They're getting extra pressure put on them. I would much rather, if you imagine you're in this situation and you're holding ace jack, you would much rather face a half pot bet on the river than a 3x pot bet, right? Especially if it's coming from a player who's capable of bluffing. So the larger he's allowed to bet, the more pressure it puts on my like medium strength hands. Now, I do have certain hands that are happy to face an overbet, right? When I have queen 10 of diamonds, I'm happy to face an overbet. I'm like, oh, sweet, he just bet 3x the pot. Now I'm going to make some money here. Even though occasionally you're going to run into a better hand, you're still happy to face the 3x pot bet, or you should be happy to face the 3x pot bet when you have the queen 10 of diamonds. So what you start to think is, well, wait a minute, if my opponent's going to do this much overbetting when the river's a diamond, maybe I should try to get to the river with some more flushes, because now I might actually win more money rather than, even though betting the turn with a flush draw is certainly profitable, right? And that's why most people do it, is like it's obviously profitable, or maybe it's not obvious, but I think it's obviously profitable to bet when you have two diamonds on the turn. The question is it the most profitable thing you can do? So if you're the imposition player here, you continuation bet the flop, and now you're on the turn and you're holding, let's say, jack 10 of diamonds. Or maybe a better example, like king 8 of diamonds. Betting is certainly profitable, right? If my only options were bet or throw my hand face down into the muck, I would prefer to bet. So betting is certainly profitable. The question is, can I make even more money by checking? And the fact that your opponent might overbet the river into you if you check gives you some additional incentive to check. When you're making your turn decision, you're saying to yourself, should I bet now and kind of take whatever immediate value there is in betting this hand, or should I think ahead to, well, if I happen to check and the river comes a diamond, maybe my opponent will assume I'm not going to have a flush since I didn't bet the turn. He thinks I'm always going to bet my flush draws on the turn, so then he's going to overbet the river. Cha-ching! Now I'm making money. And I think this is a concept that people tend to get a little backward, or not backwards exactly, but I think people kind of undersell this idea, because the way you'll hear people explain this is they'll say, well, you have to get to the river with a flush sometime. Like, you have to check a flush draw sometimes on the turn for balance, just to be balanced. And then other people are like, balance isn't important. That's, we're playing against humans and we're not playing against robots. We're not worried about balance. We want to exploit people. So the point is, this isn't like, it's not a sacrifice. It's not like you're giving up value in order to be balanced. The point is, the fact that your opponent might overbet um, potentially makes it more profitable. Like you're actually making more money by checking the turn. That's what balance is all about. It's not about doing something that's negative EV, about losing money just for some abstract idea of being balanced. It's all about making money. Balance is a tool for making money. So the idea is, if your implied odds, like at some point your implied odds get to be so good by checking, and then, if you're going to get this much money into the pot when you river a flush because you checked, then now you start to have incentive to check the turn with your diamond draws. But you're going to have the same problem if you always check the turn with your diamond draws. Well, now your opponent can, if when you do bet, can assume you never have a flush draw. And when you don't bet, he can just be careful. And now suddenly you're not going to make so much money when you check. So, the balance gets quite complicated. And if you do use a solver going all the way back from the flop, you're going to see strategies that look way more complicated than this. And that's because they're trying to balance for all these different possibilities. And they're trying to say, well, I don't want to get to the river. I don't want to have too many flush draws in my range when I bet, but I also don't want to have too many in my range when I check. But it's not just diamond rivers I have to worry about. I've got to be balanced on a club river. I've got to be balanced on when the river is a 6, when the river is a jack, a 10, a queen. When the river is an offsuit card, I also have to be sort of prepared for overbets. So, the strategy of this actually starts earlier in the hand in terms of anticipating future situations. It really starts as early as pre-flop. In terms of anticipating future situations and saying, I want to be capable, no matter what the board looks like, of always having some strong hands and always having some bluffs. And that latter part is important too, because in situations where you're capable of having strong hands, and we saw this with the overbetting as a bluff, some of your bluffs also profit from that. So if you get to a situation where you could have the nuts and you've still got 5 times the pot left in the effective stacks, you're allowed to bet 5 times the pot with the nuts. And the fact that you're going to be doing it with the nuts means that you can do it with some bluffs also. But you have to have some bluffs. Like you have to get to that point in the hand with some hands that want to bluff. And if your range is too strong for getting to that point, then you can't take advantage of those potentially profitable bluffing opportunities, and you're missing value. And so you have some incentive to get to that point in the hand, perhaps by calling with some hands you wouldn't ordinarily call, or betting some hands you wouldn't ordinarily bet, so that when that situation arises, you're prepared to make the bluff, or you're prepared to make the value bet, or you're prepared to make the call when your opponent bets, whatever it is. So planning earlier and trying to avoid playing in predictable ways on earlier streets so that your opponents can't cap your range is the term that many people use for it, or can't look at these, you don't want to be in a spot where, a particular river card is very obviously bad for you or very obviously good for you. Those are both bad outcomes. Both of those mean that you were insufficiently balanced on a previous street. And again, if you believe that you can take advantage of a particular player, like you think this guy just can't read hands that well, so I'm not worried about being balanced against him, great, super, more power to you. I do that all the time. I'm not, anti playing to exploit people. But I think that when you're playing against people who, are capable of doing some hand reading, are capable of making some intelligent bluffs, not even necessarily overbetting, but just bluffing well in various situations, you have some incentive, if you really want to make money at this game, to think about, how do I avoid being overly exploitable? And how do I make sure I'm taking full advantage of the opportunities that are presented to me to get full value from my strong hands, to do the maximum amount of bluffing I can get away with? Because bluffing is profitable. We're seeing the bluffing is not zero. It's greater than zero in a lot of these situations. So you want to make sure, if you're not bluffing in these spots and you could be making money by bluffing in these spots, you're missing out. And this is one of the main things that I use solvers for, is trying to get a sense of what kinds of situations can be taken advantage of, and how do I avoid ending up in those situations in the first place. Thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to check out or to go to the donation page on Razoo if you have not already, and just donate whatever you feel like this video was worth to you. I've been Andrew Brokos. Thanks for watching.